At our divorce hearing, my husband smirked and said, I will take half of everything you own, including your father's assets. Hi, welcome to Family Revenge. I have a new story for you today.
During our divorce trial, my husband demanded 50% of everything, including my inheritance, the private island, and the diamond collection. The entire courtroom fell silent. He sat there, smiling as if everything already belonged to him before the trial had even begun. I didn't object. I didn't argue. I simply stood up, placed my leather briefcase on the table, and said quietly, "Then, Your Honor, I suggest you take another look." A few seconds later, no one dared to breathe, because everyone had just realized who was really about to be erased from the game. You being here honestly makes my day. Before we dive in, what part of the world are you watching from your city, your country? Leave it in the comments. Let's see where this story travels. A note: this story features fictional elements shaped for entertainment and education. Names and places are imagined, but the message carried within it is purposeful and worth your time. Savannah's September light has a particular quality, golden, unhurried, as though the city itself has decided that nothing truly urgent can happen before noon. The light inside courtroom 4 was nothing like that. My name is Genevieve Sterling. I am 66 years old. The founder and owner of Sterling Heritage Museums, a private chain of preservation and restoration galleries along the southeastern coast of the United States. I have spent 30 years acquiring, authenticating, and protecting things of extraordinary value. On the morning of September 9th, 2024, I sat at the plaintiff's table in courtroom 4 of the Chatham County Superior Court in Savannah, Georgia, with a burgundy leather briefcase positioned precisely beside my right foot. The room smelled the way courtrooms always do: old paper floor wax, and the particular heaviness of air that has absorbed decades of consequential decisions. The oak paneling was dark and polished to a low shine. The fluorescent lights overhead gave everything a cool, clinical edge that had nothing to do with Georgia mornings. I had been here before: rooms like this, cases like this. The specific suspension of time that settles over a courtroom before proceedings begin. Supply chain disputes, insurance fraud involving forgeries. I knew how to sit in a chair and wait. Julian Thorne did not enter a room the way most people enter rooms. He arrived. He came through the double doors at precisely 9 o'clock, wearing a navy Brioni suit, the same suit I had watched him select at a boutique on Peachtree Street the previous spring, charged, as most things in recent years had been, to our joint account. His silver hair was combed back, with the kind of careful precision that requires both a mirror and a sincere belief that other people will notice. His stride was slow and deliberate. It was the walk of a man who had already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for the room to confirm it. He was 62 years old and carried himself like someone central casting would hire to play a distinguished Southern gentleman. It had always been his greatest skill. Marcus Webb. Julian's attorney followed 2 steps behind. Marcus was a tall man in his mid-50s, gray-suited, with a manner of moving that suggested quiet efficiency. He had practiced family law in Savannah for over 2 decades and was widely regarded as one of the more capable minds in Chatham County's courtrooms. He settled into the chair across the aisle from me and opened a leather folder with no visible urgency, the practiced stillness of an experienced litigator who wants the opposing table to wonder what he isn't worried about. My own attorney, Patricia Donovan, sat to my left. Patricia was 50 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades in Atlanta's most competitive civil litigation circles before opening her own practice here in Savannah. She was the kind of lawyer who prepared for every contingency and spoke only when she had something precise to deliver. That morning, she said nothing. She placed a single legal pad on the table, uncapped her pen, and waited. Judge Howard Calloway entered from the chamber door beside the bench at 3 minutes after 9. He was perhaps 60 heavyset, with the measured movements of a man who had presided over this court long enough to stop being surprised by anything that happened inside it. He settled into his chair, adjusted his reading glasses, and opened the case file without looking up. After a long moment, he glanced once toward the plaintiff's table. Then he returned to reading. I noticed that he did not look toward the defense table at all. Marcus Webb rose at 9:15. His opening statement was composed and methodical, the way a skilled contractor lays a foundation, deliberate and without wasted motion. He informed the court that his client was seeking equitable division of all marital assets accumulated during the marriage. He cited the relevant Georgia statutes on marital property. He noted the considerable growth of sterling heritage over the course of the marriage, suggesting that Julian's presence, emotional support, and active household contributions had played a meaningful role in maintaining the conditions under which that growth occurred. He then asked the court to award his client 50% of total marital assets, a figure his paperwork estimated at approximately $75 million, along with Julian's claimed interest in a private island off the Georgia coast and an equal share of the diamond collection held in the Sterling estate. Julian sat through every word with his hands folded on the table and a small, composed smile arranged on his face. It was the smile of a man who believes he has already purchased everyone in the room. I had lived with that smile for 4 years. I knew every version of it, the charming one at dinner parties, the patient one during arguments he expected to win, the quietly satisfied one he wore when he believed no one was watching carefully enough. This was the satisfied version. Marcus brought his opening to a close with a sentence that, I will confess, nearly made me laugh out loud. Your Honor, my client is prepared to be entirely reasonable regarding Mrs. Sterling's personal possessions. Personal possessions. I kept my face perfectly still. Across the aisle, Julian caught my eye and gave the smallest nod, the gesture of a man graciously acknowledging a minor formality before collecting what he had come for. Judge Calloway made a note on the page in front of him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent and unimpressed. Patricia placed her hand flat on the table between us, a small, deliberate signal that meant exactly one thing. I rested my hand on the burgundy briefcase. I had carried it through auction houses and private estate sales across 4 continents for 30 years. It had held authentication reports, provenance records, and objects worth more than most people's homes. It had never held anything more consequential than what was inside it today. To understand why I was sitting in that courtroom, you need to understand Savannah first and what it feels like to be profoundly alone inside a city of extraordinary beauty. 5 years before that September morning, I was standing at the outer edge of a crowded ballroom on Forsyth Park, holding a glass of champagne I had not touched, watching 300 people celebrate something I had built, and feeling with startling clarity that none of it could fill a particular kind of silence. Sterling Heritage had been the work of my life. It had started as a single shop on Bay Street, a narrow storefront with uneven floors, shelves stacked to the ceiling with estate inventory, and a reputation built entirely on the fact that I refused to sell anything I could not authentically trace and verify. Over 30 years, that shop had grown into a 4-museum chain operating across the Southeast, handling acquisition, authentication, conservation, and private restoration for collectors throughout the country. The work was slow, demanding, and deeply satisfying in the way that only expertise built over decades tends to be. The October evening in 2019 found us hosting our annual fundraising gala at the mansion on Forsyth Park, one of Savannah's grandest historic estates. A place that understood ceremony the way old Southern architecture always does. The room was everything a Savannah gala is supposed to be: Billicart salmon champagne on silver trays, a string quartet playing Ravel at a volume calibrated not to interfere with conversation, women in gowns that cost more than most people's car payments. Outside the tall windows, Forsyth Park's live oaks trailed their Spanish moss in the October dark. I had arranged every detail of this evening, and I was standing at the edge of it alone. My father, Arthur Sterling, was 88 that year. He had founded the original Bay Street shop with a modest inheritance and a knowledge of European antiques so thorough it bordered on obsessive. And for 3 decades, he had been my most trusted advisor and my most demanding critic. By 2019, his health had declined to the point where public appearances were no longer possible. His absence from that evening had left a space I could not account for with champagne or chamber music, not simply an empty chair. But the absence of the one person in any room who always knew exactly what I was thinking without requiring me to say it. I had been circling the ballroom's perimeter for the better part of an hour when I noticed a man standing alone in front of the small Flemish display near the north wall. He appeared to be in his late 50s, fit, composed, wearing a black suit without a tie in a way that felt deliberate rather than careless. He held a glass of red wine in his left hand and had not moved from that position for several minutes. He was looking at a small floral painting I had hung without a title card, a piece I had placed there specifically, and perhaps a little unkindly, to see whether anyone in the room would recognize it. Few ever did. The painting was by Jan van Huysum, a Dutch master of the early 18th century, whose extraordinary technique, building luminous floral compositions through dozens of translucent paint layers, was well documented in academic circles and almost entirely unknown outside of them. Without a label, it was simply a beautiful old painting of flowers. To someone who actually knew the period, it was a signature. I watched him for a moment. Then I walked over. "Remarkable," he said, without turning. His voice was even unhurried. "Jan van Huysum, the layering in these petals." He leaned forward slightly. "He must have applied 30 separate glazes to build that depth. You almost never see this quality outside of a major institution." I stopped beside him. I had worked alongside curators from the Rijksmuseum and the Getty. In 30 years, I could count on one hand the people who had identified a Van Huysum without a label. "You know his work," I said. "I saw my first Van Huysum at the Mauritshuis in The Hague." He turned then for the first time and looked at me directly. His eyes were gray, attentive, with the kind of steadiness that either means genuine calm or a very practiced performance of it. "A small piece. Nothing like the grand floral arrangements he's famous for. But something about the light in it stayed with me for years." The Mauritshuis was not a stop on anyone's tourist itinerary. It was a serious museum, the kind serious people sought out deliberately. "Genevieve Sterling," I said. "Julian Thorne." He extended his hand. The handshake was firm without theater. "I'm told this evening is yours." "The event is. The piece is mine as well." "Then you restored it?" "Acquired and conserved. The surface cleaning alone took 4 months." He tilted his head slightly. "What does that actually involve?" "The process I've always wondered and never known anyone to ask." No one asked about the process. They asked about the value or the insurance or whether it was appropriate for their dining room, not the process. So I told him. I described the initial condition report, the microscopic cross-section analysis to map each paint layer, the careful testing of solvents before anything touched the surface. I talked for several uninterrupted minutes, and he listened, not politely, not while scanning the room over my shoulder, but with the specific, focused attention of someone genuinely tracking what you are saying and building on it. He asked questions that demonstrated he had understood the previous answer. He did not once look at his phone. In 30 years of hosting evenings like this, I had never met a man content to simply listen. The string quartet shifted to something slower. The crowd thinned toward the dining room. Julian glanced once at the painting, then at me. "Beauty like this," he said quietly, "should never have to exist alone." It was a perfectly measured sentence, graceful enough to mean the painting, warm enough to mean something else entirely. I filed it away the way I file things that require further study before I can determine their true nature. A few minutes later, I watched him cross the ballroom toward the exit, unhurried, precise. The same studied ease he had shown from the moment I first noticed him standing alone in front of a painting no one else had stopped to look at. And as he disappeared through the doors, I felt something I did not have a name for at the time, the faint unease of someone who has walked past a forgery 100 times without seeing it. A wrongness just below the surface not yet visible under ordinary light. I told myself it was the end of a long evening. That was the first mistake I made. The 11 months between that gala and our wedding were, I understand now, the most carefully rehearsed performance of Julian's career, and he had been performing professionally for a very long time. He called 3 days after the event to thank me for a wonderful evening. He had found my office number through Sterling Heritage's public website, or so he said. He suggested coffee. I countered with the Telfair Museums on Barnard Street, which I was visiting professionally that weekend regardless. He arrived 7 minutes early and had already reviewed the current exhibition before I mentioned it. That was the first of many things Julian knew without appearing to have learned. Over the following months, he took me to dinner at Fig in Charleston, my favorite restaurant in that city, which I had mentioned only once in passing during a phone call 2 weeks prior. He arranged a weekend in Napa Valley and booked 2 nights at Meadowood, a property that does not appear in mainstream travel features. He brought me first editions of books I had cited in interviews years earlier that I assumed nobody still read. He never asked directly about Sterling Heritage, about my balance sheets, or about the breadth of what I owned. He listened and he remembered everything. At the time, his attentiveness felt like the rarest form of respect. I understand now that he had researched me thoroughly before the gala ever began. Public filings, archived press interviews, estate auction announcements, industry directories. Julian Thorne never entered a room unprepared. He simply made preparation look like instinct. By February of 2020, after 4 months, he told me he was in love with me. He said it without ceremony, standing in the kitchen of his rented apartment on Jones Street, while rain ran down the windows. I believed him without hesitation. I had very little reason at that point not to. It was Patricia Donovan who introduced the word careful into my thinking. Patricia was a family law attorney who had spent nearly 2 decades in Atlanta's most competitive civil litigation environment before opening her own practice on Drayton Street here in Savannah. She had managed several legal matters for Sterling Heritage over the years, and she had a long-established reputation for 2 things: thoroughness and an almost complete inability to confuse politeness with trustworthiness. She requested a meeting in March that had no connection to any pending business. "I've been watching the coverage of this relationship, Genevieve," she said, settling into the chair across her desk. "I've seen this type before. Charming, cultured, perfectly timed. I'd like to do my job." I told her I appreciated her concern. "It isn't concern," she said evenly. "It's practicality. Let me draft the prenuptial agreement." A prenuptial agreement is a legally binding contract signed before marriage that determines how assets will be divided in the event of divorce or a spouse's death. Under Georgia law, for such an agreement to hold up in court, both parties must sign voluntarily with financial disclosure fully made and with a reasonable opportunity to seek independent legal counsel. Patricia ensured every condition was satisfied fully and then drafted a document that went considerably further than any minimum requirement. Every asset I held before the marriage was protected: the museum properties, the corporate structure of Sterling Heritage, every account, every collection. Any inheritance I received after the wedding was covered by separate clause. The language was unambiguous in every section. Critically, Patricia insisted the signed original not be stored at home. The executed document was notarized and placed on permanent file at Credit Suisse Private Banking in Geneva, one of the most secure private banking institutions in the world, with vault facilities that make residential safes functionally irrelevant. What I kept at home was a copy identical in every visible respect to the original, but embedded with a hidden digital watermark, a verification code readable only through specific authentication software that identified the document as secondary to the Geneva original. Julian would have needed to read several pages of technical appendices to know any of this. He did not. On a Thursday afternoon in late July, he signed the prenuptial agreement in Patricia's conference room. He was offered the opportunity to review the document with an attorney of his own choosing, as Georgia law requires, be made available. He waived that right with a brief wave of his hand. He used a gold pen he produced from his jacket pocket, signed every required line with the ease of a man completing a routine errand, and slid the papers back across the table in under a minute. "Genevieve," he said, capping the pen with a light click. "I'm not marrying your portfolio, I'm marrying you." Patricia, sitting directly across from him, did not return his smile. I told myself his willingness to sign without reading, without negotiating, without even a question about the terms, was proof that he had no interest in my finances. I stored that thought carefully, alongside everything else I would eventually need to retrieve. We married on September 12, 2020, in the rear garden of my historic home on Monterey Square. The ceremony was small, 40 guests, a civil officiant. Dahlias from the garden itself still warm from the afternoon sun. September in Savannah carries its heat well into the evening, but a slight cooling had arrived that week, making the outdoor ceremony comfortable in a way that felt almost deliberate. My father was there in his wheelchair, positioned beneath the garden's oldest oak. He no longer had the strength to stand for any length of time, but he had told me without discussion that he would attend. No one argued with Arthur Sterling about things that mattered to him. He watched the ceremony from that same spot through every vow, every photograph, the long toasts that followed. His eyes tracked Julian across the garden with the unhurried attention of a man who has spent a lifetime examining things closely. His lips smiled when the occasion called for it. His eyes did not move that way once. I told myself it was the natural guardedness of a father watching his daughter marry. It was the simpler explanation, and I reached for it. Now I know that my father had spent 88 years reading performances for exactly what they were. And Julian Thorne had been performing his entire adult life, though precisely how true that was, I had not yet begun to comprehend. 16 months after our wedding, my father died on a Tuesday morning in January. And within 48 hours of the funeral, I knew with a certainty I had long refused to name exactly what kind of man I had married. Arthur Sterling passed on the 14th of January 2022 in the upstairs bedroom of the house he had lived in for 50 years. I had been with him for 3 days by then, sleeping in shifts in the chair beside his bed, holding his hand through the nights when his breathing grew shallow and the intervals between grew long. He died at 6:17 in the morning. While Savannah was still dark outside and the street was quiet, Julian managed everything that followed. He made the phone calls coordinated with the funeral home, received the first arrivals at the house with coffee and measured words. He never left my side when I needed him there. He said precisely the right things to precisely the right people. From any angle, it looked like devotion. What I understood only later, going back through those days, slowly, the way I approach anything I need to examine properly, was that Julian never actually grieved. He performed it. The lowered voice, the hand on my shoulder, the grave expression held steadily across every room. But genuine grief has a specific quality to it, an involuntary weight that resists being managed. Julian's version was too consistent, too controlled, the work of someone who had practiced loss without ever experiencing it. The reading of the will took place 12 days after the funeral in the offices of an estate law firm on Bull Street. Patricia attended with me. Julian sat 2 chairs to my right, hands folded, expression respectful. The estate comprised $150 million in cash and investment accounts, a fully titled private island in Cumberland Sound off the Georgia coast, and a collection of 23 diamonds, 8 blue Ceylon stones, and 15 yellow fancy cuts acquired over 3 decades through private auction houses in New York and London. My father had built slowly and chosen carefully his entire life. When the attorney read the total figure aloud, I turned to look at Julian. His face had not changed. He was still composed, still appropriately solemn. But his eyes had moved briefly, almost imperceptibly, the eyes of a man doing rapid arithmetic arriving at a sum. It lasted barely 2 seconds before his expression reassembled itself. "Your father was an extraordinary man," he said quietly, placing his hand over mine. I thanked the attorney. I said nothing else. Within 2 weeks, Julian began using the phrase, "our inheritance," in ordinary conversation casually and consistently, as though it were simply correct. Now that our inheritance has cleared probate, we should think about positioning. With our inheritance as a foundation, there are options worth considering. Each time I heard it, I felt something I couldn't yet name, precisely less than alarm, more than discomfort. A faint vibration like the sound a hairline crack makes before it becomes visible in the wall. He broached the subject of real estate in early March. "There's a development on Hilton Head I've had my eye on," he said one evening, sliding his phone across the dinner table with a property listing open on the screen. "Mixed residential and marina. The returns on something like this can be substantial inside of a decade." "Who are the principals?" I asked. "A group out of Charlotte. I know one of them through the club." "Have they delivered a comparable project before?" He paused just slightly. "They're newer to this scale." "Then I'd want 2 completed projects, a full environmental assessment, and independent legal review of their capitalization structure before any conversation about numbers." I handed the phone back. "Get me those and we'll talk." He changed the subject. Smoothly, without any visible irritation, a pivot to something about an upcoming trip. The kind of conversational redirect that looks like natural digression if you're not watching for it. I let it go. I was still sorting through grief, and I told myself the unease I felt was a product of exhaustion rather than evidence of anything real. What I found on my desk 3 days later discouraged that interpretation. The document was sitting face up, not concealed, not accompanied by any note or explanation, simply left in the manner of a man who no longer considers explanation necessary. A purchase confirmation for an Aston Martin DB11 in racing green. $189,000 drawn from our joint account without notice. In the United States, a joint bank account gives both account holders equal and independent access to the funds. No signature from the other party required, no notification owed. Julian had done nothing illegal. He had simply spent $189,000 of our shared money without mentioning it, because legally he did not have to. Clipped to the confirmation was a separate document, a membership acceptance letter from the Sea Island Club, one of Georgia's most exclusive private communities, requiring both a formal application and sponsorship from an existing member. Annual dues, $35,000. Same joint account. No discussion. Julian came in from the garden that afternoon, glanced at the papers, and looked at me with an expression entirely free of apology. "The car comes end of the month," he said pleasantly. "Racing green seemed right for Georgia, don't you think?" I held his gaze for a moment. Then I looked back at the papers on my desk. I told myself grief bends perception. I told myself I was reading hostility into what was only thoughtlessness. But grief does not alter the way a man's eyes move when a number is spoken aloud. And thoughtlessness does not account for $224,000 drawn from a shared account without a single word. 3 months later, I would find the first of many things Julian was absolutely certain I would never discover. By spring, Julian had a car, a Sea Island Club membership, and though I had no way of knowing it yet, a companion far more central to his plans than either of those things combined. The suggestion arrived in April over breakfast, delivered with the same casual ease Julian applied to most things he wanted. "You carry too much," he said, setting down his coffee. "The museum, the board commitments, the restoration clients, it's a great deal for one person, Genevieve. Let me find someone to handle the household logistics. Take a few things off your plate." I told him I managed well enough. "I know you do." He looked at me across the table with the specific patient warmth he had perfected over years. "That's not the point. Let me do something useful for a change." He made it sound generous. I accepted it the way I've learned to accept things offered too smoothly without enthusiasm, but without the kind of refusal that closes a door before you've had the chance to see what's behind it. Her name was Sasha Vance. She appeared 11 days later. Sasha was 35 years old with neat blonde hair cut cleanly just above the collar and a wardrobe calibrated precisely to the boundary between professional and something harder to define. She arrived for her first day with color-coded binders, a working familiarity with Sterling Heritage's event calendar that she couldn't have acquired from the job description alone, and an efficiency so immediate and thorough that it read as practiced rather than natural. She was good at her job. That in itself was not suspicious. What was suspicious was how she was good at it. Within 2 weeks, I noticed that Sasha always knew where Julian was in the house without ever needing to ask. If he had moved to the study, she would appear at the study door within minutes. If he had stepped out to the garden, she materialized near the back entrance on some errand that could have waited. It was the spatial awareness that develops between people who communicate frequently and privately, not between a new hire and the husband of her employer. I cataloged the observation. I said nothing. Through May and into the first weeks of June, the joint account statements began to accumulate line items that had no clear origin. Business entertainment, professional consultation fees, networking coordination. Each was modest enough individually, but the cumulative pattern across 60 days was not modest at all. When I raised the consultation charges at dinner one evening, Julian answered without a pause. "Industry contacts I'm developing," he said. "Commercial real estate mostly. Nothing committed to yet. I'll give you the full picture when there's something worth reviewing." "Give me the picture now," I said. "Genevieve." The patient smile, the one that had worked on me for 3 years. When there's something concrete, I let it go. I was building a file, not a fight. The discovery in June was quieter than I had expected discoveries to be. I came home from a Sterling Heritage board meeting on a Thursday evening 90 minutes ahead of schedule. The house was still. Julian's car sat in the drive. I went upstairs to change and passed through the door of the dressing room. His blue Oxford shirt was folded over the chair back where he'd left it before changing for whatever he'd done that afternoon. I reached for it out of habit to hang it properly. The scent reached me before my fingers closed on the fabric. Chanel Chance Eau Vive, a fragrance I have known for years, identifiable immediately citrus-forward light, distinctly feminine. I do not wear it. I have never kept a bottle of it in our home. It was embedded in the weave of that shirt with the particular intimacy that comes from sustained close contact. I folded the shirt precisely as I had found it. I placed it back on the chair. I walked to my office and sat at my desk. Then I opened the online calendar we had shared since our first year of marriage, originally established to coordinate schedules and household logistics. I pulled up the previous 6 weeks. Julian had logged late evening commitments on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of most weeks' office meetings, professional dinners, networking events with unnamed contacts. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I opened my own calendar alongside his. Every single date he'd logged as unavailable corresponded exactly with an evening I had a board meeting, a gallery reception, a donor dinner, or a formal Sterling Heritage event. The overlap was not approximate. It was precise. He had not been careless. He had simply never imagined I would check. I have spent 30 years working with materials that require patience, not the passive patience of waiting, but the active patience of gathering information without disturbing the subject, of watching without being seen, of understanding something completely before deciding what to do about it. I had learned that the wrong kind of action at the wrong moment doesn't clarify a situation. It simply changes what the other person conceals. I called Whitmore Investigations in Charleston on the following Monday morning. The firm had supported Sterling Heritage on several estate provenance cases over the years, thorough, confidential, and accustomed to situations involving people with significant resources and serious reasons for concealment. I gave the intake coordinator both names, Julian Thorne and Sasha Vance. I provided 6 months of joint account records and full scheduling documentation. I asked for comprehensive surveillance and background reporting on both individuals. "How much detail are you looking for?" she asked. "Everything available," I said, "and anything that isn't immediately available I'd like found." The weeks that followed were ordinary on the surface. I hosted 2 gallery openings, finalized a restoration contract for a private collection in Nashville, attended 4 board meetings. Julian cooked dinner twice a week, asked about my work with apparent interest, and watched football on Sunday afternoons. The house ran on its established rhythms. On a night in late July, I was still awake at close to midnight when I noticed the glow of the library lamp under the door at the end of the hall. I moved toward it quietly. Julian was in the corner armchair, not reading. He was holding a small black handset I had never seen before, a second phone kept separate from the device he used openly, for the precise reason that separate devices leave separate trails. His face was angled toward the screen, his attention focused and absorbed. He was smiling, not the smile he produced for company, not the patient smile he kept for disagreements. This was unguarded and private, the expression of a man who believes, completely and without question, that he is alone. I stepped back from the doorway without a sound. Later, lying in the dark with Julian's breathing steadying itself beside me, I was not frightened. I was not angry, not in the way that makes people say things before they're ready. I was thinking the way I think when I've finally recognized a forgery for what it is, not the disorienting moment of first suspicion, but the colder, clearer state that comes after. When you understand the construction precisely, when you know the method and the materials, and when you begin to see with growing certainty exactly how it will come apart. I had identified what I was looking at. Now I needed to understand the full dimensions of it, every layer, every hidden joint, everything underneath. I had the patience for that. I had always had the patience for that. In September, while Julian was planning what he believed would be the most profitable arrangement of his life, I was dismantling its foundation, one carefully documented discovery at a time. The audit began with insurance, every 2 years. The Sterling Heritage Collection undergoes a formal valuation and condition review, a standard practice in the conservation field that I had maintained without interruption since the original Bay Street location. In September of 2022, I contacted Dr. Ellison Marsh, a senior authentication specialist from the Sotheby's Savannah office, whose judgment I had relied on over the course of more than a decade. The reason I gave him was routine insurance documentation update. The reason I didn't give him was that I had been watching our household inventory with increasing unease since late summer, and I needed an expert's eyes on it before I drew any conclusions I couldn't support with evidence. Dr. Marsh arrived on a Tuesday morning with his full authentication kit, spectral analysis equipment, portable microscopes, fiber optic light sources, and the particular focused stillness of a man who collects information visually before he speaks. He worked through the ground floor rooms of Sterling House methodically, and he found the first problem within 40 minutes. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice carrying the measured care of someone delivering news they know will be significant. "I need you to come and look at this." He was standing before the Georgian silver candelabra pair in the drawing room, a set my father had acquired in London in 1987, and which had occupied the same position on the sideboard for 35 years. Under Dr. Marsh's portable examination light, the surface presented exactly as expected. Under spectral analysis, it told a different story entirely. "The silver alloy composition is consistent with contemporary manufacture," he said, without looking up from his reader. "The surface aging has been applied, artificially achieved through chemical accelerants. The craftsmanship is exceptional. But this is not the piece I authenticated 4 years ago." By the time he finished working through all the rooms, the count stood at 7. The candelabra, an 18th century Meissen porcelain urn, a small Georgian writing box with original brass fittings, 2 framed botanical engravings, And the detail that stilled me in a way the others hadn't, the small John van Huysum floral painting that had hung in the library alcove since my father first brought it home from a private sale in Amsterdam. The painting Julian had identified at the gala. The painting whose absence from the room had never once prompted him to ask a question. Whoever commissioned these replacements used someone with genuine technical skill. Dr. Marsh said, completing his written notes. The aging techniques are sophisticated. This is not off-the-shelf reproduction work. I need the full report, I said. Photographs, spectral data, written assessment, formal format, every item documented in detail. 48 hours. You'll have it. He paused. Mrs. Sterling, should I be asking any additional questions about the circumstances here? Not at this stage, I said. Thank you, Ellison. I'll be in touch. After he left, I drove directly to the museum. The Sterling Heritage Storage System maintains several hundred items in climate-controlled rotation across our 4 locations. When I pulled the internal loan records for objects documented as borrowed from Sterling House for exhibition purposes, I found 12 pieces listed as currently on extended display loan. In the physical inventory system, they did not exist. They had not been checked back in. They were not on display at any of our locations. 19 pieces missing in total originals, ranging in individual auction value from $60,000 to $400,000 apiece. Gone from the house, removed from the museum records sold. I called Whitmore that evening. The investigators had over the preceding 2 months developed a detailed picture of Julian's operation. He was moving pieces through a private broker in Atlanta, a dealer named Gerald Forsyth, who occupied the practical and legally ambiguous space between legitimate off-market transactions and the kind of collecting that depends on buyers who do not ask questions about provenance. Forsyth has brokered at least 9 confirmed sales in 5 months, the investigator reported. We have documentation on 6. The buyers are spread across 4 states, Florida, Texas, and 2 in New York. There's no apparent connection between them. Locations of the pieces, physical confirmation on 5 so far. We expect to have the remaining 14 tracked within 3 weeks. I forwarded everything to Patricia Donovan immediately. She engaged civil attorneys in Atlanta who contacted each identified buyer directly and privately. The approach was clean and carefully structured. Each collector was informed that the item had been sold by someone who possessed neither ownership nor legal authority to transfer it, which, under United States property law, means the buyer acquired nothing because you cannot legally receive greater rights to an item than the seller actually holds. In exchange for a voluntary return and a signed statement documenting the transaction, the date, the price paid the seller of record, and the broker Genevieve would purchase each piece back at full current fair market value, with no litigation and no public disclosure. Every collector agreed. When people who acquire art through informal channels are offered a quiet, financially neutral exit, they tend to take it. The originals went directly into Sterling Heritage's secure vault, a restricted climate-controlled facility at the downtown location, accessible only by key card and biometric clearance, with footage archived to an off-site server around the clock. Once they were safe, I commissioned the replacements. I engaged a master restoration craftsman, someone whose technical precision I had verified personally over a previous institutional project, and provided him with full documentation of every missing piece. Dimensions, material, composition, aging characteristics, photographic reference. What he produced were not crude forgeries. They were skillfully aged, correctly proportioned replicas that would withstand casual inspection with ease. Including in early December a small floral painting by a Dutch Golden Age master rendered in careful imitation of 30-layered glazes over a cracked ground, hung in a library alcove where the original had always been. Julian would continue selling through Forsyth's network. What his buyers would receive going forward were items worth nothing close to what they were paying. When the fraud surfaced, the liability would rest entirely with the man who had sold them. The camera installation took place the same week the last replica arrived. A private security firm fitted concealed devices in 14 rooms units, small enough to seat inside existing frame housings and decorative moldings, transmitting continuously to an encrypted server accessible only through biometric verification. The system ran without interruption. The footage archived to a location outside the property, outside Julian's reach, outside the reach of anyone who might think to look. When the installation crew left, I stood alone in the library. The Van Huysum replica occupied its alcove precisely as the original always had. From where I stood, it was indistinguishable, the same scale, the same warm ochre ground, the same soft clustering of painted flowers that had caught Julian's attention on the night we met. The night he had named the artist aloud, as if reading a caption only he could see. I had spent 3 decades learning to look at surfaces and understand what they concealed. Marriage, it turned out, had given me one more subject to study. The cameras were watching now. Every room, every conversation, every entry and exit. 3 days after the final one went live, Julian brought Sasha into my home for the first time, into the house my father had spent 50 years building while I was in Charleston, attending a conference on institutional conservation. He had no idea that 14 rooms were watching everything, and I had no idea yet just how much they were about to record. Before I reveal the night Julian reached into that safe and made the biggest mistake of his life, drop the number 7 in the comments right now. Just so I know you're still here with me. And a note going forward, this story weaves in fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Some details are imagined. If that's not something you'd like to continue with, feel free to step away. No judgment at all. January brought a cold front over Savannah that year, the kind that settles in slowly and refuses to leave. And with it came something I had been expecting for months, the moment Julian made the mistake he had spent 3 years building toward. I watched it happen on a monitor in my office at 7 o'clock on a Thursday morning with a cup of coffee cooling untouched at my elbow. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. The footage was from the study rendered in the pale, flat gray-green of night vision imaging. The frame showed the desk, the bookshelves along the east wall, the hinged wainscoting panel in the corner behind which the household safe was recessed. Julian appeared in the doorway without switching on a light. He moved through the room in the dark with the deliberate ease of someone who had rehearsed the path. He went directly to the panel. He did not search for it. 3 months earlier in October, I had gone to the safe one afternoon, while Julian was reading in the chair across the room, close enough to the keypad that the angle was clear, if he was paying attention. I entered the combination without hurrying, without concealing the sequence in the manner of someone who has grown comfortable enough not to think about it. Then I closed the panel and left the room for the kitchen. What Julian did not know was that I had changed the combination the previous evening. The sequence I entered in his presence was new, different from the one that had protected the safe for the preceding 10 years. I had chosen numbers he could follow from that chair if he was watching carefully. And then I had waited to see whether he would. The footage told me he had been watching very carefully. On the monitor, his fingers moved through the combination with measured precision. Not the tentative fumbling of someone trying from memory, but the controlled sequence of someone working from a number they had studied. He opened the panel. He opened the safe. He removed the prenuptial agreement folder. He sat down at the desk and opened it. What followed was the most attentive reading Julian had ever given that document, considerably more attentive than the 40 seconds he had spent with it in Patricia's conference room on the July afternoon 3 years earlier when he had signed every line without slowing down. He turned each page carefully reading until he reached the final section, Clause 4b, the provision specifying that all assets received through inheritance during the marriage remained the separate, non-divisible property of the receiving spouse, regardless of subsequent marital circumstances. He stopped there. He read that page twice. I watched him do it. Then he reached back into the jacket draped over the chair, the jacket he had brought with him into the study at 2 a.m, which told me the rest before he did anything further. From an inner pocket he produced an envelope. Inside it was a single sheet of paper formatted to match the document's typeface and layout, bearing what appeared at camera resolution to be plausible imitations of both signatures at the bottom. He had prepared this. This was not an opportunity seized on impulse. He had identified the clause he needed, gone drafted the replacement page, practiced the signatures, and carried it to the safe at 2 in the morning with an envelope already in his pocket. Every element of what I was watching had been planned in advance. He removed clause 4B. He aligned the replacement page in its place. He squared the document against the desk, returned the folder to the safe, replaced the wainscoting panel, and wiped the safe's exterior with the sleeve of his shirt methodically corner to corner. He left no visible trace. The timestamp on his exit read 2:51 a.m., 37 minutes start to finish. At 7:23 in the morning, I heard movement in the kitchen below. By the time I came downstairs, coffee was already made, and Julian was at the table with his phone, looking up as I came in with the unhurried expression of a man with nothing on his mind. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." I poured a cup and sat across from him. We discussed the cold front, whether the temperature would hold through the weekend, whether the garden needed any covering before the next night's forecast. At 8:15, I went to my office and called Patricia Donovan. "He took the bait," I said when she answered. A short silence. "Walk me through it." 2:14 to 2:51 this morning. Study safe. Full footage he used. The combination I showed him removed the folder read through to clause 4B and substituted a prepared replacement page. He brought the replacement with him in an envelope. Premeditated. He has a forged page in a document he believes is the controlling prenuptial agreement. Patricia said, already moving papers on her end. "Genevieve, do you understand what he's actually holding? A copy with an alteration he thinks matters. A copy embedded with a digital watermark on every page," she said, "applied during document preparation and readable only through authentication software that we hold access codes to and that Julian has no knowledge of. Under that watermark, every page of the document in your safe is legally identifiable as secondary to the original held in Geneva. The replacement page he inserted doesn't change the prenuptial agreement. What it does on camera with a prepared forgery demonstrating clear premeditation is give us documentary evidence of felony forgery under Georgia law criminal, tampering with a legal instrument, and unauthorized access to a secured container. He didn't weaken your position. He documented his own intent. "I want the footage backed up to 4 separate locations today," I said. "Off-site encrypted restricted access. I'll have it arranged by close of business." "Is there anything else on those cameras I should know about?" I paused. "Not yet," I said. "I'll be in touch." I was not ready that morning to describe to Patricia what else I had been reviewing on the system. There were recordings from the weeks before the safe footage I had watched and re-watched in the quiet of my office that I was still deciding how to handle and what it would require of me. It needed more time before I could put it into words. I backed up the footage myself that afternoon across 4 encrypted servers, then went downstairs and sat across from Julian at lunch while he described a restaurant he had read about in Charleston he wanted to try in the spring. In the weeks that followed, he was lighter than he had been in months, easier at dinner, more inclined to talk about plans about summer, about next year. The ground, he believed, had shifted in his favor. He moved through the house with the settled comfort of a man who has done something difficult and gotten away with it cleanly. He was precise in that study at 2 in the morning, methodical. He wiped the safe. He aligned the pages. He left the room exactly as he had found it, and he was completely irrecoverably wrong about which document he was holding. I let him keep his confidence. A man convinced he has already won stops looking at what is developing around him. There was, by then, quite a lot developing that I needed him not to look at, including what the cameras had captured on an afternoon in April, weeks before the safe, which I had been sitting with in silence and was not yet ready to name aloud. That was far worse than a swapped page. That was something else entirely. The footage from April 14th was 42 minutes long. I watched it twice, once in disbelief, and once with the particular clarity that arrives when disbelief has finally exhausted itself. By the time it ended the second time, my hands were completely still. What I had just watched was clear, continuous, unambiguous evidence that my husband intended to kill me. I had returned from a 2-day conservation conference in Atlanta on the evening of April 15th and gone through the archived camera footage in the routine I had maintained since December. Sorted by date, reviewed by room-in-sequence motion-flagged alerts, first general coverage after. The study. The kitchen. The front hall. Then the library. The library footage from April 14th opened at 4:57 in the afternoon. Julian and Sasha were seated in the 2 wingback chairs positioned nearest the fireplace, the ones angled away from the windows facing inward toward the room. Between them, a low table with 2 glasses of wine. The afternoon light coming through the library's tall windows was the particular deep gold of a Georgia April. The kind that turns interior rooms warm and slightly hazy, the kind that makes ordinary things look composed and deliberate. They looked like 2 people in a painting of a pleasant afternoon. They had been in the room for some time before the camera's motion sensor picked up sustained activity and began recording. Julian was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, with the settled ease he showed only with people he genuinely trusted. Sasha sat across from him, wine glass held casually at the stem, legs crossed, relaxed. Their body language was not the performance people put on when they feel observed. It was the arrangement of 2 people who believe completely that they are alone. "She's in remarkable health for 66, Julian said. "She could go another 20 years without difficulty." Sasha was quiet for a moment. Then, "There are faster timelines." Julian looked at her. He said nothing and waited. "There are compounds," Sasha said, setting her glass down on the table and leaning forward slightly, "that don't register on standard toxicological screening panels. They metabolize cleanly under ordinary post-mortem conditions. A pathologist runs the routine battery, nothing flags, without specific direction to test for a particular substance in advance. It simply doesn't appear in the results." "Where does something like that come from?" Julian asked. "European pharmaceutical supply chains primarily, networks that don't document their transactions." She paused. "You have contacts on that side of things, Julian. Better positioned than I am to put that kind of arrangement together." He considered this. He turned the stem of his glass once slowly between his thumb and finger. "And the certificate," he said. "I know someone," Sasha said. "A doctor, a licensed physician, not a GP, but someone who works in private capacity. He's done this before. Twice. The first time was in Switzerland, the second in Spain. Neither case was challenged at any point." She picked up her wine. "There's a fee. Significant, but it's a single transaction. And he's clean no record of this anywhere. How much lead time does he need?" 6 to 8 weeks from the initial introduction to be ready. The timing of the actual event is adjustable after that." She paused, studying him. "You'd want the decline to look gradual. Fatigue, loss of appetite, something consistent with age and stress that her physician is seeing, develop over a period of weeks beforehand. By the time the acute event occurs, the medical history already supports the narrative." "Her doctor knows her well," Julian said. "They've worked together for years." "That's fine. We don't need her doctor to do anything except make a reasonable clinical observation about a patient in declining health, which he will because she'll actually be in declining health." She lifted her glass again. "The attorney doesn't matter. Attorneys don't inherit, they manage estates. And with the prenuptial document corrected, the inheritance protection is gone. Surviving spouse has significant priority under Georgia's intestate succession statutes." She looked at him directly. "We'd want to move within the year, before she reviews any of her existing documents." Julian nodded. Once. Slowly. "I'll make some inquiries," he said. I made myself continue watching. The conversation ran for 23 minutes beyond that exchange, specific, operational, and unhurried. They discussed seasonality and how a health decline might be managed around my annual travel schedule. They mentioned the need for Julian to re-establish contact with a network he had used in a different context years ago, in a different country, under circumstances I did not yet fully understand. They talked through the transfer of assets that would follow. They talked about what Sasha's arrangement with Julian would look like afterward, a percentage structured as a consulting contract. Over 3 years. By 5:39, when they moved out of frame toward the kitchen, I had a 42-minute recording of a premeditated murder conspiracy that named a procurement method, a document falsifier, a timeline, and a financial arrangement for after my death. I made 3 copies on separate encrypted drives before I did anything else. One went into the Sterling Heritage Vault that evening. One went into a sealed envelope for Patricia. The third I packaged for secure courier delivery to Credit Suisse in Geneva, to be held alongside the prenuptial agreement in the same vault under the same access conditions. Then I looked out the library window. Julian was in the garden below, moving slowly along the south rose beds with a pair of pruning shears. He worked with the methodical care of someone who takes genuine pleasure in the task, examining each branch before making a cut, stepping back occasionally to assess the shape of the whole. He was wearing the old canvas garden jacket he kept by the back entrance. He looked unhurried and content. He looked like a man without a single pressing concern in the world. I called Patricia at 7:45. "I need you to hear this before I tell you what I have," I said when she answered. "Tell me." The footage from April 14th is 42 minutes. It documents a conversation between Julian Thorne and Sasha Vance, in which they discuss in specific operational terms the procurement of an undetectable compound, the falsification of a death certificate through a paid overseas contact, a proposed timeline, and a financial arrangement between themselves to be executed after my death. I waited. "I have copies on 3 encrypted drives. One will be at your office tomorrow morning." Patricia did not speak immediately. "Genevieve," she finally said. "I know," I said. "This is beyond the civil proceeding. This is a criminal matter, which is why I'm calling tonight. We need to accelerate everything, the filing timeline, the asset documentation, all of it. I want us ready to move before anything else changes." I looked out the window. Julian had set down his shears and was standing at the center of the garden looking at something above the far hedge line. "We'll discuss the rest in the morning." I set the phone down and stayed at the window a moment longer, watching him. That evening, I found a glass of red wine on my desk that Julian had left there some time before dinner, a small, considerate gesture he had established over the past year when I worked late. I carried it to the bathroom and poured it down the drain. The following morning, I told Julian the bedroom lock had seized overnight and had an exterior firm come to replace it. He accepted the explanation without interest and without suspicion. He had never in 4 years once questioned his ability to accurately read the people around him. That certainty, so complete, so settled, so entirely unexamined, had been the thing that made him formidable. It turned out it was also the thing that made him vulnerable. And, as I would eventually come to understand, I was not the only person in his life whose nature he had fatally miscalculated. The woman he had brought into this house, into this room, into this conversation, she was making her own calculations. She had been making them for quite some time. By November, Julian had forged a legal document, orchestrated the theft and fraudulent sale of 19 authenticated pieces of art, and conspired to commit murder. In his estimation, the only remaining obstacle between himself and $150 million was the courtroom. So he reached for that too, and in doing so, he handed us the one thing our case still lacked. The 8 months between April and December had been months of deliberate, unglamorous preparation. Patricia and I had assembled the evidentiary file with the same methodical attention I apply to provenance research, camera footage cataloged and authenticated. Whitmore's surveillance documentation cross-referenced against financial records, the Atlanta recovery agreements organized with their accompanying witness statements, and a forensic accounting of the joint accounts activity spanning nearly 2 years. Alongside all of this, the background investigation into Julian Thorne's personal and legal history, an investigation that had widened considerably since the spring continued to develop in directions neither Patricia nor I had anticipated when we first opened it. We had not yet filed the divorce petition. Patricia had recommended twice that we hold once, while critical financial documentation underwent independent verification, and once while the identity investigation completed a final research phase. We were within weeks of being ready when she called me on the morning of December 9th. "I need you at the office today," she said. "There's something you need to hear in person." Patricia's office on Drayton Street held the particular quiet of a city slowing toward Christmas foot traffic lighter than usual, the afternoon light at a low gray angle through the tall windows. She was at her desk when I arrived, a legal pad centered in front of her, and 2 folders to its right. She waited until I was seated before she began. "I received a call yesterday from Special Agent Stephen Harker," she said. "He's with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit out of the Atlanta field office, the division that investigates misconduct involving public officials, including sitting members of the judiciary." She paused. "He reached out to me directly as your attorney of record. He's been peripherally connected to our investigation since the summer, Genevieve. He was the bureau contact on the identity component, the portion of Whitmore's research that crossed into federal jurisdiction." I waited. At the Savannah Bar Association's fall dinner in November, Patricia continued setting her hands flat on the desk. An individual approached Judge Howard Calloway. This individual represented himself as acting on behalf of Julian Thorne. He passed the judge an envelope during the course of the evening. "What did it contain?" $50,000 in cash," she said. "And a handwritten note. No signature, no identifying marks, promising an additional $200,000 upon." And I'm quoting the language precisely, "a resolution favorable to my client in the pending proceeding." The room held the kind of stillness that follows information that requires a moment to fully land. "Judge Calloway left the dinner," Patricia said. "He went home. The following morning, he filed a complete report with the Georgia Judicial Qualifications Commission, the independent body that governs judicial conduct in this state, and simultaneously notified the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. He made no contact with any party involved in your civil matter, no communication with Julian's attorney, no contact with you, with me, or with anyone associated with either side of the proceeding. He followed the mandatory reporting protocol to the letter, and he has not deviated from it since." And the FBI's response: "They opened a formal investigation within 48 hours, Patricia said. "Agent Harker's unit identified the intermediary, the individual who made the approach at the Bar Association dinner, and established through both financial records and communication data that this person was a paid agent, contracted specifically to carry out this transaction on Julian's behalf. The connection between the middleman and Julian Thorne is documented, confirmed, and admissible." She folded her hands. "As of this month, the hearing will proceed under full federal observation. Calloway has been asked to continue presiding exactly as normal." He agreed without hesitation. "Why keep him on? He could recuse and hand it to another judge. The Bureau prefers the original assignment. A recusal triggers a postponement reassignment proceedings. Public notice, it draws attention, and potentially alerts Julian that something has changed around the case. If Calloway continues from Julian's perspective, everything looks ordinary." Patricia's expression was level and deliberate. Julian tried to purchase an outcome, and instead gave the FBI a pretext to have 2 agents seated in that courtroom with full arrest authority the moment proceedings conclude. She picked up the legal pad and read from her notes. "Agent Harker asked me to convey the following: Whoever advised Mr. Thorne to take this approach has just added a federal bribery charge to what is already a substantial criminal file. We would appreciate Mrs. Sterling's continued cooperation in allowing the hearing to proceed as scheduled and in making any relevant documentary evidence available through proper counsel channels. Patricia set the notepad down. I told him he would have everything we have, and he understood that everything includes the April footage. He understood, she said. He was not surprised. I stood and moved to the window. Below on Drayton Street, Savannah was making its ordinary December adjustments, a woman transferring grocery bags from a car. Two men in overcoats talking outside the building across the intersection. The seasonal lights strung between the trees at the far end of the block, already lit against the early dark. The city was operating at its normal register entirely unaware. Julian had over 4 years reached into every available corner of this situation. He had tampered with a legal document in the middle of the night. He had stripped 19 pieces from a collection my father spent 3 decades assembling. He had sat in my library and discussed the method and timing of my death. And now he had sent a man with an envelope to a sitting federal judge. Each move had seemed presumably like control. Each one had instead been a thread we had followed back to him, added to a file he did not know existed, placed in the hands of people with the authority to use it. When do we file? I asked without turning from the window. The first week of January, Patricia said. The identity documentation will be complete by then. I want that in hand before we move. The sound of a pen uncapping. 2 weeks at most. I turned back from the window and sat down. Patricia was already opening the second folder, the thicker one she had not yet touched. Her expression had shifted from the precise, procedural register she used for legal mechanics to something quieter, more considered. The shift was small, but distinct. There's more, she said, about the inheritance itself, and about something your father left behind that I don't think you ever fully read. The divorce petition was filed on January 9th. Julian was served 2 days later, a Thursday morning, while he was eating breakfast on the veranda in the thin winter light. Patricia told me that afternoon that when the process server placed the documents in his hands, his coffee cup had moved against its saucer in a way that was small but visible. She did not editorialize. She simply noted it and then said, "That was the first crack." And we hadn't yet started. The meeting at her office on Drayton Street was 10 days after the filing. I had spent those days preparing questions, the discovery timeline, how Julian's attorney would likely respond initially, what we expected the first 60 days of proceedings to look like. I had a legal pad. I had been for the better part of 2 years, very effective at occupying the position of someone building something rather than enduring something, and I had intended to continue. I was not prepared for what the second folder contained. Patricia had 2 files on the desk when I arrived, as she had on December 9th. The first I recognized, the civil litigation file, organized and thick, tabbed in the color-coded system her office used. The second was older. The paper cover had the pale, careful quality of a document that has been preserved rather than simply stored. She didn't preface it with much. "This is your father's complete will," she said, placing it in front of me. The estate attorney presented the executive summary to you in February of 2022, which is standard practice for complex estates. He was required to hold the remainder until certain conditions were satisfied. When we notified him of the pending divorce filing last month, he contacted me immediately. The triggering language in the sealed section had been met. "There's a sealed section," I said. Section 9, Clause F. Your father's instructions to the administering attorney were written out in a separate letter and attached to the relevant pages. Patricia found the tab and opened to it. The letter said one thing: she'll know when it's time. I looked at the open document in front of me. Arthur Sterling's name was in the upper heading, followed by the execution date October of 2019. The same month Julian had stood in front of a painting no one else had stopped to look at, and named the artist correctly. "Read me the clause," I said. Patricia read, In the event that Genevieve Margaret Sterling initiates legal proceedings for the dissolution of her marriage on grounds that include spousal infidelity, financial misconduct, or criminal conduct on the part of her spouse, all assets constituting the estate of Arthur William Sterling, including all liquid assets, investment accounts, the Cumberland Sound Island property, and the certified gemstone collection shall transfer immediately and irrevocably to the Arthur Sterling Preservation Trust, a charitable foundation established pursuant to Appendix D of this document. These assets shall not be deemed marital property. They shall not be subject to division lien encumbrance or judgment in any legal proceeding. No claim by any party shall attach to them in any form. She set the document down and looked at me. A conditional transfer to a charitable trust is a distinct legal mechanism, she said. It doesn't depend on the prenuptial agreement and it doesn't interact with it. Your prenuptial protected assets from being commingled and classified as marital property. This clause achieves something different. It removes the inheritance from the marital estate entirely and places it in a separate legal entity that belongs to no individual. Even if Julian had successfully altered the prenuptial agreement, he would have had nothing to claim. The inheritance was never available to him. It transferred out of reach the moment you filed. I sat with that for a moment. He started the inquiry before the gala, I said. It was not quite a question. Within 2 weeks of their first meeting, Patricia confirmed. The estate attorney said the private investigation file was referenced in your father's correspondence. He didn't share its contents with the attorney, only informed him that what he had learned was the basis for the clause. She paused. He knew enough to protect you before you had any reason to protect yourself. I thought of September of 2020, the garden behind the house on Monterey Square, and my father in his wheelchair beneath the oldest tree, dressed appropriately for a wedding he had attended out of something that was not celebration. His lips arranged in the proper expression, his eyes doing something entirely separate, steady reading, processing a performance he had already categorized correctly before any of the guests had arrived. I had told myself that day it was protective instinct. I had been generous to myself in that interpretation. Why didn't he say anything to me? I asked. Patricia answered in the measured, careful way she uses when she has thought out how to say something difficult. According to the estate attorney, your father's correspondence addressed this directly. He wrote that a direct confrontation presenting you with his investigator's findings, telling you what he believed about Julian, carried a significant risk. He believed you might interpret it as interference, that you would look for reasons to disagree with his conclusion, because the conclusion would have required you to believe that you had been deceived. She looked at me steadily. He wrote that he had known you your entire life, and he understood that no one tells you what to see. He chose a different approach. He trusted your judgment. He put the protection in the structure, not in the argument. There was a long silence in the office. He trusted you to figure it out, Patricia said quietly. And he made certain that whenever you did, whether it took months or years, Julian would have nothing left to take. I reached for the document and turned to the last page. Arthur Sterling's signature sat at the bottom, the precise, slightly angular hand I had known since I was small, unchanged through 8 decades of use. I had seen it on correspondence, on acquisition agreements, on the deed records stored in Sterling Heritage's archive, on the birthday cards he wrote by hand every year because he considered printed messages a form of carelessness. The same hand that had handed me my first authenticated piece 40 years ago and said simply, "Look at it until it tells you what it is." Something gave way inside my chest, not loudly, not in the way that renders a person temporarily unable to function, but in the quiet, deep way of something that has been bracing against continuous pressure for a long time and has finally been permitted to release. I did not attempt to manage it. I sat with it. Patricia placed a box of tissues at the corner of the desk with the same practical precision she applied to everything else and redirected her attention to her notepad, giving me the minute without making it a moment. When I looked up, she was still writing. "He didn't live to see it come right," I said. "No," she said. "But he built it so it would. That's not nothing, Genevieve." She set her pen down and held my gaze for a moment. "That's everything he could do from where he was standing." I pressed the document flat with both hands, breathed, straightened in the chair. My father had known from the first evening. Through every calibrated gesture Julian had deployed over 4 years, every dinner, every signed document, every careful word, my father had been standing somewhere ahead of all of it, preparing the ground quietly and without announcement. He had protected me from a distance he couldn't cross, with the same still precision he had used to build everything he had ever built. The name Julian Thorne had existed for exactly 4 years before I walked across that ballroom in Savannah and asked a stranger about a painting. 4 years was enough time to build a credible biography, a coherent history, a consistent social manner, the right references in the right registers. It was not enough time to erase what had come before it. The Whitmore Investigations Report arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, 47 pages, bound in a plain gray cover delivered by secure courier to my office at Sterling Heritage. I cleared my afternoon schedule, closed the office door, and left instructions at the front desk that I was not to be interrupted. Then I sat down at my desk and read every page. The central finding was precise and corroborated across multiple countries. The name, Julian Thorne, did not appear in any passport registry tax record, educational enrollment, employment, history, or legal filing in any jurisdiction before the year 2015. No birth certificate in any English-speaking country. No social security record predating that year. No documented address before London. No prior family, no academic history, no paper trail of any kind. The man who had told me he grew up outside Edinburgh and studied at St. Andrews had, as far as any records database in the world was concerned, materialized in a London flat in 2015, fully formed at 53 years of age. His name was Victor Laszlo. He had been born on the 3rd of September 1962 in Budapest, Hungary. His early life existed in fragments across several Eastern European record systems, a secondary school completion, a younger sibling, several years of theatrical training completed in the late 80s at a conservatory in Bratislava. His subsequent career in acting produced almost nothing of professional note and gave him in time the one skill that would eventually prove worth considerably more than any role he had been offered. In 2008, he appeared in the cast records of a small repertory company in Berlin, listed under a stage name that corresponded to neither of his known identities. The production ran 11 performances and closed without review. He left no forwarding address and filed no income tax return for the following 2 years. 4 years later in Vienna, the performance had matured considerably. The subject in Vienna was a woman named Helga Brauer, 71 years old, the widow of a German-Austrian manufacturing executive whose estate was substantial and well documented. The Austrian federal criminal case file, which Whitmore had obtained through investigative channels and included in the report, detailed the operation with considerable specificity. Victor, working under a third identity, whose documentation the Austrian authorities had partially traced, introduced himself to Helga Brauer at a benefit concert at the Wiener Konzerthaus. He identified her interests with precision. He spent 8 months in careful cultivation. He moved into her Innsbruck home the following spring. He proposed marriage in October of that year. By December, he had transferred 4.2 million euros from 3 accounts held in her name to a series of offshore accounts in jurisdictions that maintain no disclosure obligations. He left on a Thursday morning before she woke. The Austrian arrest warrant was issued the following Saturday. He was 48 hours ahead of it and has not returned to Austrian territory since. I set the report down and looked at the wall of my office for a long time. The method was not merely similar to what he had done with me. It was the same construction, the cultural event, the careful listening, the long and unhurried approach. the positioning within the household of a wealthy older woman who had reason to value being heard. 8 more years of practice, a higher target value, otherwise identical. In 2015, Victor Laszlo had surfaced in London with a complete American identity, a United States passport in the name of Julian Thorne, a social security number attached to a person who had died in infancy in 1963, and a credit and address history that had been assembled backward with professional precision. The document package had been acquired through an organized network operating across 3 countries. The cost for a package of this caliber, according to a source cited in the report, was between $60,000 and $90,000. Victor had apparently considered this an acceptable cost of business. Interpol maintained an active file on Victor Laszlo across 3 jurisdictions: Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands. The Austrian case was the most thoroughly documented. Helga Brauer had been willing and had testified at length. The other 2 cases involved circumstances the report described with careful restraint as presenting certain evidential challenges. At 4:15 that afternoon, Agent Harker called. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, "I'll assume you've had a chance to go through the documentation." "I finished it an hour ago," I said. "Then I want to give you a clear account of how the hearing date looks from our end." He paused briefly. "We'll have 2 agents positioned inside the courtroom before proceedings begin on September 17th. They'll be there from the start and will remain in place throughout the full hearing. The moment Judge Calloway renders his final decision in the civil matter, before Victor Laszlo has an opportunity to leave that room, we execute the arrest warrant. The language has been coordinated with our Interpol liaison. European extradition proceedings will follow through standard channels." "He used a fraudulently obtained U.S. passport," I said. "How does that interact with the extradition timeline?" "The passport fraud is a separate federal charge which gives us independent jurisdiction regardless of the European warrants," Harker said. "Between the domestic charges and the international file, he has very little room to work with. Courts tend to move efficiently on individuals with documented false identity at this scale. The Austrian case alone is substantive." "Understood," I said. "We appreciate your cooperation throughout this process, Mrs. Sterling. The footage documentation, in particular, has been significant." I thanked him. The call ended. I sat for a moment at my desk after, with the report closed in front of me, and the Interpol photograph, a surveillance image from Vienna in 2013. Sheehan copied from the Austrian Federal Criminal Office lying beside it. The image showed a man in a gray suit descending the stone steps of a concert hall in the early evening. The angle was oblique. The face was clear enough. It was the same face, the same structure of the jaw, the same composed and unhurried expression. 11 years younger than the man I had watched navigate a crowded ballroom in Savannah. A different city, a different name, documented in the Austrian file, a different woman visible. 2 steps behind him in the frame, moving carefully down the steps in formal clothes. Unaware that Thursday morning had already been decided, I found myself wondering whether Helga Brauer had described his listening to the investigators afterward. Whether she had said he was different from other men she had encountered: his patience, his attention, the specific quality of his focus when she spoke. Whether that had made the loss of it and everything else more difficult to account for than the money. I thought it probably had. The man who had once told me Savannah felt like home had never had one. Only roles adopted and discarded, borrowed names and fabricated pasts. Women who were identified, studied, and approached with the practiced care of a craftsman who knows exactly which instrument the material requires and applies precisely that, no more and no less. I was to have been his concluding chapter, the longest run, the most profitable close. Instead, he had walked into a house full of cameras he had no idea existed, attempted to alter a document that was never the controlling one, and handed an envelope to a judge whose first act the following morning was a call to the FBI. 7 months remained between that February afternoon and the hearing date. I closed the folder. I straightened it against the edge of the desk. I intended to use every one of them. 7 months is a long time to observe a man who doesn't know he's being observed. By the morning of the hearing, I understood Julian's patterns with a precision he had never bothered to develop about mine, how he moved through social rooms, which interactions he valued, how he used physical ease to project inevitability. I knew his habits the way he had once catalogued mine methodically in advance, for the purpose of gaining an advantage he did not plan to announce. I dressed before 6. The choice had been made weeks earlier, a navy dress in the precise shade of the Sterling Heritage Museum domes, a color I had worn to formal occasions for 30 years without thinking about it, because I had never needed to think about it. It fit correctly. It communicated exactly what I wanted to communicate. I did not consider anything else. The house was quiet while I finished. I took one final walk through the ground floor rooms, the study, the library, the drawing room where the paintings maintained their positions with the same stillness they had always carried. 4 years ago, I had walked through these rooms and understood very little about what was happening inside them. I understood everything now. I did not linger in any of them. There was nothing left in this house that required more of my time. I carried the burgundy briefcase through the front door and down the steps at 7:45. Wright Square was in its early September arrangement when I arrived on the block, adjacent to the courthouse, the live oaks still full and green. The light coming in at the lower angle that arrives in the south when summer begins its slow and reluctant withdrawal. The air held the particular humidity of a savanna morning that has not yet decided whether it will remain tolerable or reassert its summer terms. A city maintenance worker was crossing the square from the far corner. A woman in a gray coat was walking a dog along the shaded path. Savannah in the morning conducting its ordinary business. Julian was on the courthouse steps when I arrived. He was standing with Marcus Webb near the top of the main entrance staircase, laughing at something with the ease of two people who have established the comfortable register of old professional friends. Julian's jacket was open. He stood with his weight slightly back, unhurried and expansive in the manner he had spent decades perfecting the physical grammar of a man who has made his peace with the outcome before the proceeding has begun. His hand rested on Marcus's shoulder for a moment, while he spoke the familiar gesture of someone reinforcing alliance consciously or not. I watched them from the sidewalk for a moment before I continued toward the entrance. Marcus Webb and I had known each other since 2011, a professional relationship that evolved through a period of several years into something closer and ended in 2018. With the kind of conclusion that permits people to remain civil in the same city without difficulty. When Julian contacted Marcus's firm in January of 2024, I received a call from Marcus within 48 hours of his accepting the engagement. At the signing of Julian's client agreement, Marcus had placed a second document on the table before anything else. A conflict of interest disclosure and waiver, a standard professional instrument required under Georgia's rules of professional conduct when an attorney holds a prior personal relationship with an adverse party in a proceeding. The document named us both, described our prior connection by duration, characterized its nature accurately, and stated clearly that Julian was waiving his right to object to any conflict arising from Marcus's dual history and his right to consult independent counsel before executing the waiver. Julian had not read it. He had glanced at the cover page, produced the gold pen he apparently kept in his jacket for moments requiring signature, signed every indicated line in approximately 90 seconds, and slid the papers back across the table. The man who had spent considerable time and preparation studying a legal document before altering it in a residential safe at 2 a.m. had signed away his right to challenge his own attorney's divided loyalties without reading a sentence of the relevant provision. Marcus had contacted me that same afternoon. 4 words, he signed, were set. I went through the courthouse entrance without pausing at the steps. The main corridor was already active, attorneys with files, courthouse staff, a cluster of people outside the room adjacent to ours. Julian was already inside. Working the hallway with the focus of someone who knows that the room you occupy before a proceeding shapes the room you walk into during it. I recognized several of the people he was speaking to. A commercial real estate attorney he had spent the last 2 years cultivating at a cost to the joint account that Whitmore's forensic summary had placed at $43,000 across 18 months. A city council member whose charity gala Julian had attended 3 times each time as the attentive and generous husband of Genevieve Sterling. 2 men from the development community he had positioned himself alongside, using the same social capital, the same resources, the same borrowed currency. He shook hands with confidence. He touched elbows. He angled his body in the particular way that signals to a room that you are at ease, because you have reasons to be. I walked past all of it and found the door to courtroom 4. Patricia was at the plaintiff's table when I came in, 2 folders open in front of her and a legal pad aligned beside them. She had been here, I suspected, since 8:15 at the latest. She looked up when I came through the door. Judge Calloway was at the bench already reading the case file with the settled concentration of a man who has been in this chair long enough to begin every proceeding in exactly this posture. He did not look up when I entered. He would not make eye contact with me before proceedings opened. He had not made any contact with either party since November outside of formal channels. He was doing precisely what he had agreed to do, sitting in his chair and waiting. I set the briefcase beside my chair and sat. "Ready?" Patricia said without lifting her eyes from her page. I placed my hand on the top of the briefcase. "Begin," I said. Marcus Webb opened for the defense with the composed efficiency of a lawyer who has spent 26 years building credibility in this county and knows precisely how to use it. I listened without taking notes. Julian sat through it with his chin slightly raised and his expression arranged in the settled confidence of someone who has already played out the proceeding in his mind and found the result acceptable. When Marcus finished, Julian turned and looked directly across the aisle at me. The smile was small, controlled. The private expression of a man extending the courtesy of acknowledging a contest he has already concluded internally. I looked back. I did not smile. I did not redirect my attention elsewhere. I held his gaze with the unhurried steadiness of someone who has spent 4 years looking at this face, and now finally understands every layer of its construction. Something shifted behind his eyes. A very small adjustment, a fractional tightening at the outer corner, a barely perceptible recalibration in the set of his expression. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then the composure reassembled as it always had, as it always would, right up until the moment it could not. It was the first crack I had seen in him that he had not placed there deliberately. Patricia rose from her chair. Inside the burgundy briefcase were 7 exhibits. 4 years of assembled evidence, and everything my father had trusted me to be capable of protecting. Across the aisle, the most carefully rehearsed performance of Julian Thorne's career was about to face the one audience he had not prepared for. Patricia rose from the plaintiff's table with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has been waiting without impatience for a single moment, and who is now having received it. Entirely done with waiting. "Your Honor," she said, "before this court proceeds to the question of asset classification, there is a foundational document requiring the court's attention first." She opened the first tab in the exhibit file and removed a clear archival sleeve containing a bound document. The sleeve was the institutional kind, the sort used by legal and custodial entities for materials requiring unbroken chain of custody documentation. She approached the clerk's table and placed it there with the accompanying authentication certificate from Credit Suisse Private Banking Geneva and the court-certified translation of the Swiss notarization records. "Plaintiff's Exhibit A," Patricia said. "The original prenuptial agreement executed by Genevieve Margaret Sterling and Julian Thorne in July of 2020. Notarized and held on continuous deposit at Credit Suisse Private Banking Geneva from the date of execution to the present. Authentication certificate and full chain of custody documentation are included in the submission package." Judge Calloway received the document from his clerk and examined the authentication certificate first, the brief, focused review of a man who has been reading legal documentation for the better part of 4 decades and knows within seconds what he is looking at. Then he opened the prenuptial agreement itself and began to read. I was watching Julian. He had registered the sleeve from the moment Patricia lifted it from the exhibit folder. He was 20 feet away, separated from it by an aisle and a chamber that held perhaps 40 people, and he could not read the text. But something in the document's dimensions, its cover format, the institutional weight visible even across that distance, had placed itself incorrectly in his understanding. That, he said. The word was barely voiced and directed at no one. He stopped before the sentence formed. Marcus placed his hand briefly on Julian's wrist, the practiced gesture of an experienced attorney reclaiming the pace of a client who is about to speak without instruction. "Let me handle this," he said low enough that it reached only the two of them. Marcus rose and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, I'd ask the court's permission to examine Plaintiff's Exhibit A before proceedings continue." Calloway looked up from the document. "Approach." Marcus crossed to the clerk's table with the measured, unhurried stride of a lawyer who has been doing this long enough to know that pace communicates authority to a watching room. He examined the authentication certificate. He reviewed the chain of custody documentation from Geneva, then the notarization records, then opened the prenuptial agreement and read through its relevant provisions. Nothing registered on his face. He replaced the document on the clerk's table with the same care with which he had picked it up, returned to the defense table and leaned down close to Julian. "You told me the prenuptial agreement had been modified," Marcus said just above a whisper. "It was," Julian said. "I handled it myself. I went into the safe and I took they. Then where?" Marcus said with the specific, very quiet precision of someone who already understands the answer. "Is that document right now?" Julian looked at the sleeve on the clerk's table. He looked at it for several seconds without speaking. "I watched the understanding arrive. It did not come as a sudden fracture, not the way a wall comes down when a single load-bearing point fails. It came as something slower and more complete, a progressive redistribution of weight. The way a structure settles when the foundation it had been resting on reveals itself to be fundamentally different from what was assumed." He had gone into the study at 2 a.m. He had entered the combination he had been given, the one he had read from a chair, while watching a woman he believed to be less observant than himself. He had opened a safe, removed a folder, read through a document, located the specific clause he needed to eliminate, and replaced it with a prepared substitute. He had been methodical. He had been precise. He had been, by his own assessment, thorough. He had operated on a copy. Judge Calloway found the relevant section and read it into the record. Section 4, Clause B. He said, his voice carrying the flat, formal register of a court recorder. "All assets received by Genevieve Margaret Sterling through bequest, inheritance, or testamentary gift from Arthur William Sterling at any point during the duration of the marriage shall remain the exclusive separate property of Genevieve Margaret Sterling. These assets shall not be subject to classification as marital property, shall not be divided in any legal proceeding, and shall not be encumbered, liened, or assigned to any party by any means, regardless of subsequent circumstances." He set the document flat on the bench surface and looked across the room. "This clause is intact and unaltered." Marcus turned to Julian. Julian shook his head barely once, the involuntary motion of someone attempting to recalibrate information that will not recalibrate. "I need to see it directly," he said. "Counsel may approach," Calloway said. They crossed to the clerk's table together. Calloway placed the document in front of them. Julian turned directly to the final page. The digital watermark embedded in those pages was not perceptible to the unaided eye. But the signatures on the final page, his own, applied in July of 2020 with a gold pen produced from his jacket pocket in Patricia's conference room, in under a minute those were entirely visible. They were his handwriting, not a forgery of it. The signature he had placed in the copy had been built from a studied imitation of his own hand. It was not the same. He straightened. He turned slightly away from Calloway and Marcus before he spoke. "This," he said, "is not the copy that was in the safe." "Is there another document?" Judge Calloway said, with the considered neutrality of a man who has known the contents of this envelope since December and has waited 6 months to hear this sentence spoken aloud in his courtroom. "That you'd like to present to this court, Mr. Thorne." Julian said nothing. He and Marcus returned to the defense table. Julian sat with both hands flat on the surface in front of him. The raised chin, the squared shoulders, the settled certainty of a man who has previewed his own verdict and found it acceptable, all of it was simply absent. What remained was a controlled stillness of an entirely different character. I watched his face. It was not anger. People caught in the early stages of collapse sometimes generate anger, the reflexive assertion of someone who believes they can still recover position through force of presence. Julian did not produce anger. What I saw was colder. Recognition. The precise technical comprehension of where a specific calculation had failed, and what the failure of that calculation meant for every position built upon it. He was still working through the implications, still assessing what remained, still looking for the remaining usable options. He had operated on a copy, and the original had been waiting in Geneva for 4 years. Marcus Webb turned in his chair. His gaze crossed the room 20 feet and found mine directly for a second and a half. In 26 years across 3 arguments before the Georgia Supreme Court, and more hearings than either of us could easily count, I had never once seen Marcus Webb allow his personal response to a proceeding to register on his face while inside a courtroom. Not once. Not for any case. For less than 2 seconds, he allowed himself the smallest expression I have ever seen on a human face. Julian Thorne was 12 inches to his left. He did not see it. I did, and I knew exactly what was about to happen next. Julian was still looking at the watermark on the last page of the prenuptial agreement when Patricia said, with the composure of someone who has not moved at her own pace for 4 years and is now moving at precisely hers, "Your Honor, directing the court's attention to Plaintiff's Exhibit B." She turned toward the rear of the room and gave a brief nod to the courtroom technician, a member of her office staff, who had spent 3 evenings in this building the previous week, ensuring that the projection system would accept the footage's file format without interruption. A screen descended from the ceiling track at the front of the room to the left of the bench. The ambient lighting did not go dark, but it dropped just enough that the projected image would read clearly against the screen. If Exhibit B is 42 minutes of continuous unedited footage recovered from a legally installed residential security system operating within the Sterling House on Monterey Square, Patricia said, addressing Calloway. Installation was completed December 12, 2022 by a licensed contractor with all permits and documentation included in the submission package. The date and timestamp embedded in the recording is continuous and visible in every frame. The footage has not been edited, trimmed, compressed, or altered in any respect. Full chain of custody documentation from the recording device to this submission is included. She nodded to the technician. The screen at the front of courtroom 4 came to life. The library of the house on Monterey Square. Late afternoon light through tall windows, golden and unhurried. 2 chairs near the fireplace. A low table with 2 glasses of wine. The resolution was sufficient. The audio, when it came through the courtroom's speakers calibrated that morning for exactly this purpose, was clear. The room changed. It was not a dramatic change, not the audible shift that sometimes moves through audiences at a theater when something decisive occurs on stage. It was the change of people who have understood, within the first 30 seconds of footage, what they are watching and have stopped moving as a result. Notebooks that had been open went still. The quiet shuffling of papers at the back of the gallery ceased. The air in the room settled into a particular held quality, the silence not of waiting, but of witnessing. I did not watch the screen. I had seen the footage twice in its entirety in the quiet of my office alone. I knew every exchange, every pause, every specific and operational detail that Sasha Vance had laid out with the practical calm of someone discussing a renovation timeline. I had no need to watch it again. Instead, I watched the room. I watched Marcus Webb place his legal pad face down on the table in front of him slowly and without looking away from the screen. I watched the court reporter's hands pause their motion at approximately the 6-minute mark, and then resume with a different, more deliberate quality. I watched two members of the gallery journalists, given the way they'd been positioned, lower their pens simultaneously and not raise them for the duration. And I watched Victor Laszlo. He had gone completely still from the first moment his own voice came through the speakers. Not the composed, managed stillness he had deployed throughout the morning that has a particular quality. An active internal organization that creates the appearance of natural ease. This was categorically different. This was the stillness of someone who has arrived at the understanding that there is no presentation left to manage. His hands were flat on the table. His expression had not changed in any discernible way. He watched 42 minutes of footage of himself discussing the method, timing, and financial arrangement of his wife's murder in a room he had been entirely certain was private, and he did not look away from any of it. The recording ended at the 5:39 timestamp. The technician returned the lights to their standard level. Patricia waited 10 seconds. The room was still. "Your Honor," she said. The individual in that footage discussing the acquisition of an undetectable compound through European pharmaceutical supply networks and the facilitation of a falsified death certificate through a paid overseas contact is the respondent in this proceeding. The second individual, the woman present throughout the recording, is Sasha Vance, listed in the respondent's pretrial submission as a character witness available to speak in his behalf. She paused briefly. As of the date of our filing, Ms. Vance was no longer reachable at any of her documented contact addresses or through any contact information provided to this proceeding. This is fabricated. Julian's voice came out with force, not loud but deliberate and directed. The voice of someone who has identified the only available position and is committing to it regardless of its defensibility. She arranged all of this. The cameras. The recording she constructed, the entire situation. "Mr. Thorne." Calloway's voice did not rise by a single degree. "You will remain silent while opposing counsel presents evidence to this court. If you speak again before being recognized from the bench, you will be removed from these proceedings." He let the sentence settle in the room for a moment. "Do you understand what I have just said to you?" Julian turned to Marcus. Marcus gave him nothing. No nod, no signal, no visible instruction. Only the practiced, neutral expression he had held since proceedings opened. Julian turned back. He sat. "Please continue, Ms. Donovan," Calloway said. "Thank you, Your Honor." Patricia opened the third tab of her exhibit file. Exhibit C addresses the question of the respondent's legal identity. The door on the left side of the room, the administrative corridor entrance which had remained closed since the start of proceedings, opened. The man who came through wore a dark jacket and no tie. He crossed directly to the clerk's table, presented federal credentials without pausing, and placed a sealed folder of documents on the table with the composed efficiency of someone who has been in a great many courtrooms. "Your Honor," Patricia said, Special Agent Stephen Harker of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit Atlanta Field Office is present to authenticate the Interpol and federal documentation included in Exhibit C. Agent Harker's involvement in the federal matter connected to these proceedings was disclosed to the court in pre-hearing conference. Calloway looked at Harker. "Agent Harker, identify yourself for the record." Harker provided his full name, badge number, and unit designation for the court reporter. Then he stepped back. "Exhibit C," Patricia said, "comprises Interpol identification records, documentation of fraudulent United States passport procurement, and federal background information establishing the following." She looked at the man sitting at the defense table. The individual known in these proceedings as Julian Thorn is Victor Laszlo, a Hungarian national born, September 3, 1962, in Budapest, currently subject to an Interpol international notice in connection with financial fraud cases in Austria, the Netherlands, and Germany. The United States passport presented at the time of the Sterling marriage was obtained through a documented criminal network. No individual named Julian Thorn exists in any birth civil or government record prior to 2015. The room held a silence I had not heard in it before. Calloway looked at the man across from him for a long moment. His expression was composed, judicious, and entirely without surprise. From this point forward, Calloway said, "This court will address the respondent by his legal name." He paused. "Mr. Laszlo." Victor Laszlo stood up. "You cannot conduct this in a civil divorce proceeding." There was something different in his voice now, not the social register he had constructed and maintained for 9 years, and not the compressed force of his earlier outburst. Something older, something that existed before Edinburgh and the gala and the considered charm and all of it. "This hearing has no jurisdiction to Mr. Laszlo." Calloway's voice was level, carrying no heat at all. "Sit down. I will tell you once that what occurs in this courtroom during the next 2 hours will determine considerably more than the division of marital assets. I strongly recommend you consult your attorney before you say anything further." 4 seconds passed. Victor Laszlo sat down. He turned immediately to Marcus, leaning with the contained, urgent attention of a person who needs to understand within seconds how much ground has shifted and what is still left. Marcus listened without nodding, without responding, without allowing a single thing to register on his face. Then Marcus reached forward and placed his hand on the manila folder he had kept closed on the table in front of him all morning, the one he had carried in separately from the main case file, the one he had not permitted his paralegal to approach or open. Victor glanced at it. Something moved across his face that was not confidence, and was not cold recognition, and was not the managed composure of a man who believes he still has options. It was a different thing entirely. The thing the rest of us feel when the last calculation resolves against us. Marcus looked across the 20 feet of courtroom between us. I gave him the smallest nod I had. He opened the folder and began. The recess lasted 45 minutes. I spent them in a small conference room off the main corridor with Patricia and a bottle of water, seated at a table that was too large for 2 people, and exactly the right size for what we didn't need to say to each other. There was nothing to discuss. Every exhibit had been prepared. Every sequence locked 2 weeks earlier, every contingency accounted for. What had been 45 months of accumulation was now 45 minutes of execution, and the execution was proceeding without deviation. Through the narrow window at the far end of the room, I could see the main corridor. Victor's outline moved through it, pacing stationary on the phone, pacing again. His legal team surrounded him, with the visible anxiety of professionals who had arrived at a proceeding, prepared for one version of a case, and found by 11:30 in the morning that the version they had prepared for no longer existed. The calls he was making, I was fairly certain, were going to people who could not help him at this stage, and who would not be glad to receive them. At 1:15 we went back in. "Ms. Donovan," Calloway said, "the afternoon session is yours." "Thank you, Your Honor." Patricia opened the 4th tab without ceremony. Exhibit D, the Arthur Sterling estate. She addressed the court simply. The documentation in Exhibit D established the trust structure under which Arthur Sterling's estate had been held since February of 2022, a separate, irrevocable account in the name of the Arthur Sterling Preservation Trust, with no commingling of any kind with joint marital funds at any point during or after the transfer. She asked Calloway to enter into the afternoon's record the relevant provision of the Estate Document Section 9, Clause F, formally establishing the triggering condition and its legal consequence. Calloway read the clause into the record. He read it in the flat, even voice he used for everything, and it landed in the room the same way it had landed in Patricia's office 8 months ago. Like architecture, Something built rather than spoken. Victor spoke before Calloway had fully finished. That provision cannot apply, he said. The estate was received during the marriage. It was part of the marital. The estate, Patricia said, was held in a separate irrevocable trust from the date of transfer. Not $1 was deposited into any joint account. Not $1 was commingled with marital assets at any point. Under Georgia law, an inherited asset held separately and never integrated into the marital estate does not constitute marital property and is not subject to division regardless of when it was received. She set the trust account statements on the clerk's table. The documentation is complete. There is nothing of the Arthur Sterling estate available for allocation in this proceeding. Calloway looked at Victor briefly. Victor said nothing further. Exhibit E, Patricia said. The antique collection. Dr. Ellison Marsh took the stand with the efficient brevity of a man who has written a comprehensive report and sees no reason to repeat it at length. He confirmed his methodology: spectral analysis, carbon dating, comparative composition testing, and his findings. 19 items from the Sterling residence and affiliated museum collection had been replaced with reproductions. Not one reproduction passed spectral verification. Not one was consistent with the date of origin claimed in the associated provenance documentation. Thank you, Doctor, Patricia said. He stepped down. She turned to the second component of the exhibit, a set of 14 pages compiled by Whitmore Investigations. Email communications between the respondent and a private broker in Atlanta, conducted through accounts registered under variant names, but resolved through IP address analysis. Documented in the investigative file to a single device consistently operating from the Monterey Square address. Those transactions were conducted with her full knowledge. Victor's voice had the stretched quality of an argument delivered past the point at which the speaker believes it. She was aware of every. Patricia carried the 14 printed pages from the clerk's table and placed them directly in front of Victor, not before Marcus but precisely in front of Victor, where he could not avoid them. She set them down without comment. Victor looked at the top page. His jaw moved once. He did not finish the sentence. He did not attempt to start another. The documented damages owed to the 19 purchasers of the replaced items, Patricia said, returning her attention to the bench, total $2.1 million. This liability attaches personally to the respondent as the individual who conducted and profited from those transactions. Calloway noted it without visible reaction, in the manner of a man who had been expecting it since December. Exhibit F, Patricia said, the Cumberland Sound property. She placed the title documentation and covenant records on the clerk's table. Arthur Sterling had designated the island as a conservation area in 1987, a formal environmental covenant established under the Georgia Environmental Protection Act, funded by a private endowment and attached irrevocably to the title. The covenant ran with the land, not with any specific owner. Any party receiving title assumed all associated obligations, $340,000 per year in mandatory maintenance and compliance costs, with personal environmental liability in the event of any breach, without cap. The property could not be commercially sold. It could not be developed. It could not be leased for income. It could be owned at $340,000 annually and nothing else. The respondent's pretrial filing listed the Cumberland Sound property among the primary assets sought. Patricia said, Your Honor, the court may wish to hear from respondent's counsel on whether that request is being maintained. Calloway looked at Marcus. A beat passed. Marcus had been silent through the entire afternoon session. He straightened slightly in his chair, reviewed the page directly in front of him with the brief, deliberate attention of a man confirming a decision already made, and spoke. The respondent withdraws the request as to the Cumberland Sound property, he said. Marcus. Victor turned and his voice was controlled, but not entirely. What are you? Trust the process, Julian. Marcus's voice was completely flat. He did not look at Victor. He looked at the page. 3 words. In another courtroom, in another kind of case delivered between attorney and client in the ordinary rhythm of a proceeding going as planned, they would have been routine reassurance. In this room, in this afternoon, they arrived with a register that required no elaboration. Victor heard it. He went still for a moment, turned back to face the bench, set his jaw, and said nothing. The room held that silence for a moment. "There remains one final set of exhibits, Your Honor," Patricia said. The quality of her voice had changed, not louder, not harder, but carrying the particular weight of someone who has reached the final door and has her hand on the handle. She reached into the burgundy briefcase with both hands. I watched Victor watch her hands move. In 4 years, I had catalogued his expressions with the care I give to fragile and consequential things. I knew the full range of what that face could produce, the warmth, the patience, the calculation, behind the warmth, the performance, behind the patience. What was on it now was none of those things. It was not strategy. It was not performance. It was the thing that surfaces when every remaining position has been closed off, and what lies underneath the construct finally becomes visible. For the first time in 4 years, Victor Laszlo was genuinely, unmistakably afraid. Fear on the face of a man who has spent decades performing confidence looks like a very particular kind of stillness. The stillness of someone who has understood all at once that every exit from the room has been sealed. Patricia reached into the burgundy briefcase and produced 3 sealed envelopes. She set them in a row along the front of the plaintiff's table, slightly separated from one another, and picked up the first. "Exhibit G," she said, "medical documentation." The records were from a hospital in Vienna dated 2009, obtained through investigative channels, and authenticated by a certified medical records translator. They had been cross-confirmed in 2024 by an independent Atlanta laboratory retained specifically for that purpose. Victor Laszlo had been diagnosed with congenital primary infertility, a condition present from birth, irreversible by any known medical intervention, and documented in his own medical history since the age of 29. During the first 2 years of the marriage, Patricia said, the respondent repeatedly expressed to Mrs. Sterling his desire to have children with her. He described it as his most genuine aspiration. He characterized it as a central reason for wishing to build a life together. She addressed the bench without inflection. Those statements were made to a woman in her early 60s who had every reason to find them significant. They were made by a man who had known for 30 years that they were impossible. Calloway looked across the room. His voice was entirely flat. "Mr. Laszlo, were you aware of this condition at the time you made those representations to your wife?" The silence that followed was approximately 8 seconds long. 8 seconds is not a long time. In a room with a court reporter's hands above her keys and 40 people holding still in the particular way that courtrooms produce when something has arrived that everyone in the room recognizes simultaneously, 8 seconds is enough. Victor said nothing. Calloway made a note and moved on without further comment. "Exhibit H," Patricia said. The second envelope contained Marcus Webb's professional background in full, a complete record, including his period at a London firm in the early 2000s and 18 months in Dublin, before returning to American practice. His connection to Genevieve Sterling was documented with the same clarity it had been given in the COI waiver signed 8 months ago, but with more detail. 7 years of shared professional engagement that had extended into something personal concluded in 2018, 1 year before Julian Thorne had appeared at the gala on Forsyth Park. Defense counsel and Mrs. Sterling share a 7-year personal and professional history ending in 2018, Patricia said. When the respondent retained Mr. Webb's services, Mr. Webb notified Mrs. Sterling within 48 hours of accepting the engagement. He accepted this case with her full knowledge and written agreement. A conflict of interest disclosure and waiver was formally presented to the respondent, who signed it without requesting independent counsel to review. She paused. The respondent signed away his right to object to that history without reading what that history was. Victor turned and looked at Marcus. Whatever he had been about to say arrived, and did not make it out. He sat with it instead. Looking at the man who had been representing him since January, the man who had called Genevieve Sterling 48 hours after Victor had hired him, who had made that call before he accepted a single document, who had been operating with full knowledge of the situation since the engagement began. Marcus set his pen down deliberately. He closed the case file in front of him. Julian, he said without raising his eyes from the table, you hired me to win. I've been preventing you from losing more badly than you deserve. He picked up the pen and returned to his notes. Exhibit 1, Patricia said. The third envelope held joint account statements, 27 transactions between June of 2022 and November of 2023, each transferring funds from the Sterling marital joint account to an external account registered in the name of Sasha Vance. The total was $341,500. Ms. Vance's apartment at 1440 Abercorn Street was vacated 4 days before this hearing, Patricia said, setting the statements on the clerk's table with the same composure she had maintained throughout the afternoon. Her phone has been disconnected. She has not responded to any process related to this proceeding. The joint account transfers represent a marital waste claim of $341,000 separate and additional to the art fraud damages already entered. Victor looked at the statements. He looked at them for a moment with the expression of a man who has completed a calculation and arrived at a number he did not include in his projections. The woman he had trusted with the plan had calculated with considerably more precision than he had extended to her exactly when to leave and exactly how much to take on the way out. He looked around the room. Marcus was working. Calloway was writing. Patricia stood at the plaintiff's table with the settled stillness of someone who has completed what they came to do. Not one person in courtroom 4 was looking at him with anything resembling alliance. He was the only person in the room who had not known that from the beginning. Something left Victor Laszlo's face in that moment, not the confidence which had been leaving in stages since 9 in the morning, and not the cold composure of a man still working through his options. Something underneath both of those. The particular thing that had anchored all of it, the belief that he had been, at any point in the past 5 years, the one writing this story. He hadn't been. Calloway set down his pen. He removed his reading glasses and held them in both hands, a gesture I would learn afterward that he reserved for remarks he considered to carry particular weight. He let the room settle completely before he spoke. Mr. Laszlo, he said, before I render my decision, there is one final matter this court must address. He looked across the room with the level patience of a man who has been waiting since November to say the next sentence. A personal matter, between this bench and you. A courtroom at the moment before a verdict carries a particular quality of stillness, not the absence of sound, but the presence of consequence settling into the corners of the room. I had read about that quality in depositions and case notes over 30 years of professional life. Sitting there that afternoon, I finally understood what the words had meant. Calloway set his reading glasses on the bench surface and looked at the room. Before this court addresses asset division, he said, there is something that occurred prior to today's hearing that must be entered on the record. This court has been aware of it since December of last year. The federal file has contained it since that date. He described the Savannah Bar Association's fall dinner in November of 2023. A representative of the respondent had approached him that evening and handed him an envelope. He had taken it, left the dinner, driven home, and placed the envelope untouched in his study. The following morning at 9 o'clock, he had called the Georgia Judicial Qualifications Commission and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit in Atlanta. From inside the bench, Calloway produced an evidence bag, sealed federal case markings on the exterior, an FBI evidence number visible through the plastic. He set it flat on the bench where the room could see it. The envelope contained $50,000 in cash and a handwritten note promising $200,000 more upon a resolution favorable to the respondent. He looked across the courtroom. I made no contact with any party in this proceeding. This courtroom has been under federal observation since December. I agreed to continue presiding because it was the right thing to do, and because the FBI asked me to. Victor began to rise. The rear left door opened. Two agents in dark jackets entered and stopped 2 steps from the defense table. Victor sat. Calloway continued without pause. The prenuptial agreement authenticated this morning is valid and fully binding in every clause. All assets of the Arthur Sterling estate, $150 million in verified liquid holdings, the Cumberland Sound Conservation Property, and the certified gemstone collection are the exclusive and undivided property of Genevieve Margaret Sterling. They are not subject to allocation of any kind. He turned the page. Actual joint marital assets are minimal and have been assessed accordingly. All personal debt incurred by the respondent during the marriage is the respondent's personal liability. Damages arising from the fraudulent substitution of 19 authenticated collection items totaling $2.1 million attach personally and solely to the respondent. He looked at Victor directly for the first time since the afternoon began. The attempted bribery of this bench has been entered into the federal criminal record and will be addressed in the appropriate jurisdiction. He set down the document. Agent Harker rose from the 2 seats he had occupied along the left wall since 1 o'clock. He read the arrest warrant in the compact, complete language that federal warrants use. Victor Laszlo, also known as Julian Thorne, the charges enumerated in their proper sequence: conspiracy, financial fraud, fraudulent use of a federal identity document, bribery of a judicial officer. The international components to follow under Interpol coordination in connection with active notices in Austria, the Netherlands, and Germany. The 2 agents moved. Victor stood as they reached him, not quickly, not with the contained urgency of someone calculating a remaining option, with the simple verticality of a man who has no options remaining and has arrived finally and without theater at his actual posture. One cuff, then the other. The sound of it was very small in the room. He turned before they moved him toward the door. He looked across the courtroom at me. "Genevieve," he said, "only the name. Nothing attached to it. No explanation, no argument, no final version of events. Just the name he had spoken for 4 years. The one syllable of the whole construction that had always referred to something real." I looked back at him. I did not speak. I held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to understand that there was nothing I needed to say, that the room had not already said more completely than I could. And then I let it go, because there was nothing left in that direction that required my attention. They walked him through the door. Calloway lifted the gavel. He held it for a moment in the quiet. "Court is adjourned." The sound went through the room and through the 4 years that had preceded it, through every camera and forged document and calculated evening and prepared exhibit, and when it finished, it was simply done. Patricia's hand came to rest on mine on the table. She didn't speak. Neither did I. I became aware of my own breathing for the first time since 8 that morning, slow, unremarkable. The rhythm of a body that has been released from sustained forward motion and is finding its ordinary pace again. Outside the courthouse windows, the September light of Savannah had moved into its deep, late afternoon gold, the kind that arrives in this city when the day has completed its work and is beginning without hurry to withdraw. There was one thing remaining. Not in this building. Not through Patricia, not through any file or exhibit or legal instrument. In my own hands, on my own schedule. I picked up the briefcase. I stood. Justice, I have come to understand, is not a single moment. It is a sequence of consequences, some fast, some slow, some more fitting than any courtroom could have deliberately designed. Victor Laszlo left American soil in early October under federal custody, extradited to Vienna and into the jurisdiction of 3 countries that had been waiting for him in one form or another for more than a decade. The Austrian case alone, Helga Brauer, who was still alive, who had been waiting to testify again, was expected to take years. The American charges would wait their turn in the sequence. The Atlanta collectors who had purchased 19 forged pieces discovered their losses through their own authentication processes, as buyers of expensive things eventually will. The compensation claims amounted to $2.1 million in aggregate, attached to a man who had no assets in any accessible jurisdiction. That is a particular kind of ending. Not the dramatic one, but the accurate one. Sasha Vance was never found. $341,000 left Savannah 4 days before the hearing and has not been accounted for since. I think about her occasionally, not with anger, which would require more sustained attention than the situation warrants, but with something closer to a professional recognition. She had assessed the position and made her calculation. She had simply calculated for herself, rather than for the plan Victor believed they shared. In that sense, she may have been the only person in the entire arrangement who had been entirely clear about her own intentions from the beginning. The 19 pieces from Sterling Heritage's collection had been in secure storage since October of 2022. They were reinstalled in the weeks before the hearing quietly, without announcement, and had been in their correct positions for months by the time the proceedings concluded. The Van Huysum went back to the east wall of the main gallery, where my father had placed it in 1994. Where it had always been. Where it belonged. In October, I established the Arthur Sterling Preservation Fund, a grant-making organization providing legal support and resources to women working in art authentication, cultural heritage conservation, and related fields who face institutional obstacles in their work. The initial endowment came from the estate. The mandate came from something harder to name and more durable than money. On a Thursday evening in the third week of October, I stayed in the building after the staff left. I walked through Sterling Heritage in the quiet it produces when empty the climate system. The old floors, the particular silence of rooms that contain things made by people who died centuries ago. I stopped in front of the Van Huysum. It is a small painting. Flowers in an urn, a stone ledge, the suggestion of a garden receding behind. The artist has been dead for nearly 300 years. Over the course of my marriage, this work had been authenticated, stolen, replaced with a replica, recovered and restored to its position, without sustaining the slightest damage to its actual surface. It is entirely indifferent to the uses that have been made of it. I looked at it the way my father taught me to look at things that matter, without hurry, without conclusion already formed, until it told me what it was. What it was on that Thursday evening was exactly what it had always been. A painting made by a man with a precise understanding of light, depicting ordinary things with the full attention they deserved. Nothing about it had changed. I was the variable in the room. I was what had changed. The October light through Sterling Heritage's tall windows moved at the angle that only arrives in autumn in this city. Long and unhurried and deeply gold. The quality Savannah produces, as though it has been practicing since before any of us arrived, and intends to continue long after we are gone. It fell across the painting and across the floor, and across me standing there. For the first time in 4 years, I allowed myself to stand completely still, without watching, without waiting, without preparing for what might come next. My father used to say that the most valuable things are not the things that accumulate over time. They are the things that endure. Sterling Heritage had endured. The paintings had endured. And I, it turned out, had endured longest of all. I used to believe love was enough to see through a lie. I was wrong. God rarely sends warnings we cannot miss. He sends quiet ones that we choose not to hear. Don't be like me. Don't mistake charm for character. The people willing to wait are often the ones who have already decided how it ends. Every family drama story begins somewhere ordinary. Mine began with a painting and a man who named its artist. Among all the family revenge stories I've witnessed, the lesson never changes. Truth does not disappear. It waits. The most dangerous person in any family drama story is not the one who threatens you openly. It's the one who makes you feel safe. These family revenge stories remind us that what we build matters less than what we protect. If this family drama story stayed with you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it. And if you want more family revenge stories like this one, subscribe and stay close. Thank you for watching until the very end. A note: stories ahead contain fictional elements built for reflection and education. If that's not for you, no judgment. Choose what serves you best.
That's how it ends. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.